Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really profound look at the period that, it really defined the endgame of the war in Europe. We're talking about the ground warfare campaign that surged from the Normandy beaches all the way to those final grinding battles on the German frontier.
It's the story of the Great Pursuit, for sure.
Absolutely, but it's also, and I think more importantly, the story of how that incredible success nearly broke the entire Allied war machine.
Yeah, that's the real tension here. I think it's crucial for us to move past that simple narrative of just a victorious race across France. When you really scrutinize the sources covering the second half of 1944, what emerges is this powerful and incredibly complex picture. It's an analysis of strategic decisions, the harsh realities of logistics, and these profound differences in command performance across the United States armies in the European theater of operations.
We are focusing on that exact moment, right? The moment when triumph itself created this almost existential stress on the system. Our mission today, then, is to distill the core challenges from this crucible period. We really need to unpack how the Allied forces went from this open maneuver warfare to the slow, brutal, set-piece battles of attrition that were needed to get through the West Wall.
And we want to understand why. Why did that phenomenal pursuit stall? And maybe more critically, how were these institutional and doctrinal flaws exposed under the extreme pressure of these high-tempo operations?
To do that, we're drawing from a really foundational stack of material.
We really are. We're leaning heavily on Ronald Andidora's insightful look at the autumn of 1944, which does a great job framing those strategic tensions. And then there's Daniel P. Bolger's paper, Zero Defects, which gives us a really critical lens on the command culture.
We also get that operational insight from Christopher R. Gabel's detailed study of the Lorraine campaign.
Right, and David W. Hogan's concise history, Northern France, the United States Army campaigns of World War II. And then, maybe most critically of all, is the hard data. The authoritative administrative data you find in Roland G. Ruppenthal's Logistical Support of the Armies.
The numbers in Ruppenthal's work, they really do tell the story. They reveal the true boundaries of what was even possible strategically.
They absolutely do.
Okay, let's unpack this journey. And let's start with what has to be the greatest paradox of the whole campaign. The logistics shock caused by winning too fast.
It's such a fascinating problem to have. The initial phase, especially the breakout after Operation Cobra and the exploitation that followed, it was so wildly successful that it became its own worst enemy, logistically speaking.
And that's because the planning for Operation Overlord was based on the wrong war, almost.
In a way, yeah. It was based on extremely conservative timelines, and those were rooted in the expectations of almost a static trench warfare development. That was the legacy of the First World War, and it haunted the planners.
So they were building this entire logistical infrastructure to support a cautious, steady advance.
A crawl, almost.
Yeah, and then the German resistance just collapses after the Falaise encirclement, and the pace just accelerates wildly. Can you maybe walk us through the numbers to really quantify this shock?
The numbers are, and I'm not exaggerating here, they're a lesson in planning failure that was driven by successful execution. So initially, American forces were actually a little bit behind schedule. They reached the planned D+20 line by D+49.
Okay, so about 30 days late, which sounds acceptable given the circumstances.
It was, under the original projections. But then the pace completely inverted. Between D+49 and D+79, so in just a 30-day window, the armies covered ground that the original plan had conservatively scheduled to take 70 days.
70 days, so they were moving at more than twice the planned rate.
More than twice the rate. That level of acceleration you can imagine, it just instantaneously rendered all the careful logistical forecasts totally moot. And Ruppenthal's analysis really drives this home, how quickly the communications zone was just completely overwhelmed.
Especially when it came to the Seine River. That was a huge objective.
A critical objective. The pre-invasion plans were built around this assumption that the communications zone, which is this massive bureaucratic machine responsible for everything, administration, supply, support, that it would be sustaining maybe 12 United States divisions somewhere near the Seine River by D+90. That was September 4th.
But the reality was completely different.
Radically different. When D+90 actually arrived, the communication zone was suddenly struggling to support 16 divisions. And those divisions weren't, relaxing at the Seine. They were operating roughly 150 miles beyond it, deep into Belgium and eastern France.
So the logistical tail had to support a third more combat power, operating significantly farther forward over lines of communication that frankly hadn't even been built yet.
They didn't exist.
So what was the ultimate the temporal displacement. How much time did this phenomenal speed actually save in the grand scheme of things?
Well, it saved nearly 8 months of hard fighting. Hogan notes that the original planning goal for reaching the German border near Aachen was D plus 330. That means the spring of 1945. May, specifically.
May of 1945.
Yes. And the Allied armies reached that vicinity in September of 1944, 230 days earlier than the most optimistic original projection. I mean, the momentum was just intoxicating.
And General Eisenhower himself made that critical decision, right, to prioritize momentum over letting logistics catch up.
He did. It was a high-level and very risky decision. He refused to stop at this end. He believed, and probably correctly, that slowing down would just give the German command time to reconstitute a coherent defense.
That decision, I mean, tactically brilliant in the short term, but it created what the sources call an unbearable supply task. So if the armies are moving that fast, what were the specific infrastructure failures that immediately became critical?
The primary failure was the inability to develop the crucial lines of communication, especially reliable railheads. Ruppenthal explains that the logistical plans were rendered, and this is his phrase, largely obsolete.
Obsolete overnight.
Pretty much. The rapid advance meant that proper rail transfer points and major supply dumps just could not be established beyond the initial beachheads and, the St. Lo area early on. This forced the communications zone to rely heavily, immediately, on road transport on rubber tires and the still limited capacity of the Normandy ports and beaches.
And the entire administrative base had to move with them.
Everything. The hospitals, the depots, the replacement centers, it all had to be shifted northeastward months ahead of schedule. And that placed this immense burden on an organization that was already, frankly, struggling to breathe.
But before this whole crisis became totally crippling, there was one final brilliant tactical maneuver that really capped the pursuit, the Mons coup. It was sort of the high water mark right before the dam broke.
It really was a classic exploitation of an enemy in full retreat. As these shattered, fragmented German formations, mostly from the 7th Army, were streaming eastward, General Omar Bradley, who was commanding the 12th Army Group, he recognized this opportunity on General Courtney Hodges' First Army front.
And he ordered Hodges to shift his axis north.
Exactly. This maneuver near Mons, in Belgium, it succeeded in forming this massive pocket.
And what was the result on the ground?
It was decisive. The First Army virtually demolished what little was left of the German 7th Army. They bagged over 25,000 prisoners. And that effectively cleared the way for an uninterrupted push right to the Belgian border and directly to the German frontier, the West Wall.
So Hogan highlights this as the moment the tactical pursuit reached its strategic peak.
He does. But as you said, this very victory delivered the armies right into the hands of that strategic constraint, supply capacity.
So they had successfully pushed the enemy to the very edge of defeat, only to find themselves slamming headlong into a strategic wall built entirely of fuel barrels, rail gauges, and supply manifests.
A perfect way to put it.
And that success immediately ignited the great strategic debate among the Allied high command. How do we proceed from here? This is that famous conflict between the single massive thrust and the broad front approach.
Yeah, this debate perfectly encapsulates that tension between military ambition and physical reality. Andidora's The Autumn of 1944 provides a really sharp analysis of this conflict, especially Field Marshal Montgomery's aggressive vision.
Let's start there then. What exactly was Montgomery's northern thrust proposal, and why was it so appealing to him?
Montgomery envisioned a single, concentrated, decisive punch, a knockout blow. His proposal, it evolved a bit, but the core idea was to launch this massive force. Initially, he was suggesting some 40 divisions, though this was later pragmatically clarified to his own 21st Army Group, plus most of the United States 12th Army Group, in a single powerful column.
And the objective?
This column would drive through Belgium and the Netherlands, bypass the strongest German defenses, seize a crossing over the lower Rhine, and aim directly for the industrial heartland, the Ruhr. He even explicitly stated the ultimate objective was Berlin.
I mean, that sounds like a war-ending move, a true knockout blow. But given the staggering logistical problems we just discussed, was this even remotely feasible? A 40-division thrust?
In a word, no. Andidora makes the judgment that logistically it was, and I quote, quite simply impossible in the autumn of 1944.
But the strategic logic was sound, at least.
Oh, absolutely. The key benefit of the northern thrust was clear. It used the most favorable invasion terrain, it offered the shortest and most direct route to the Ruhr, and most crucially, it would open up those deep water channel ports. Antwerp being the most essential prize. Montgomery's plan was strategically sound if the logistical base existed to support it.
But it just didn't.
It didn't, not even close.
So, if the single thrust was a logistical fantasy, why did General Eisenhower opt for the broad front, or the dual thrust, which he eventually pursued? Was it just strategic skepticism, or was it entirely dictated by supply?
It was overwhelmingly dictated by necessity. Now, Eisenhower certainly harbored some strategic skepticism about committing all his forces to a single narrow axis. And that's a perfect target for a German counterattack.
Yeah.
But the supply constraints were the real driver.
He kept qualifying his commitment, didn't he?
Repeatedly, which allowed General Bradley, who was commanding the largest United States forces, to advocate for and then execute a dual-thrust approach.
What was the cold, hard logistical rationale for that, forcing the armies to fan out like that?
The sources make it absolutely clear. Eisenhower concluded that the early seizure of deep-water ports, particularly Antwerp, and the systematic improvement of the base facilities behind the front lines, these were essential prerequisites. They had to be met before any final decisive drive could even be attempted.
You can't sustain that many divisions over one vulnerable supply line.
You can't. Not when it's stretching all the way back to the Normandy beaches. Eventually, you're talking over 90 Allied divisions. It's just not feasible.
So the logistical tail essentially determined the shape of the entire offensive.
Exactly. Ruppenthal's figures, again, they reveal the brutal truth. Bradley noted that the communication zone could only guarantee enough supply support for a major attack by one American army, say, First Army in the north, and only if all other United States forces reverted to a purely defensive posture.
So supply allocation became strategic policy.
It was the ultimate policymaker. Eisenhower chose to allocate the maximum priority to the northern armies, Montgomery's group, and elements of First Army, which of course necessitated that famous commitment to Operation Market Garden.
And that commitment to the north meant someone else had to pay the price.
It did. The strategic priority placed the burden of the sacrifice, as the sources put it, directly onto the forces operating south of the Ardennes, primarily General Patton's Third Army.
They were basically put on rations.
Minimal supply allocations. They were often ordered to conduct an aggressive defense, or simply hold their ground while the priority efforts unfolded up north. It was a calculated risk that really relied on Patton's aggressive nature to keep the Germans pinned down with extremely limited resources. And that tension strategic desire versus logistical capacity, it defined the rest of the campaign.
Since the early phase was moving too fast for rail repair, the armies had to rely on that stretched road transport. This brings us to that monumental organizational effort, the Red Ball Express.
The Red Ball Express was just an unparalleled feat of motor transport organization. It was designed specifically to bridge that immense gap created by the stretched lines of communication.
Its job was to funnel the most critical supplies forward.
Exactly. Gasoline and ammunition, those were paramount. From the Normandy supply depots eastward to the advancing armies.
And this wasn't just a convoy, it was a highly disciplined, dedicated corridor, right? How extensive was the network when it peaked?
It became massive. Ruppenthal provides the exact measurements. The total network reached 924 miles. They used a dual route system, a northern and a southern route, running one-way traffic to minimize congestion and collisions.
Highway system, basically.
A military highway system. The northern route round trip was 686 miles, and the southern was 590 miles. At its absolute peak in late September 1944, the Express was dispatching an average of 8,209 tons of supply per day.
And how many trucks did that take?
Approximately 5,400 trucks, and these trucks were averaging about 35 miles per hour, completing a round trip at an average of 71.2 grueling nonstop hours.
That is just an astonishing output for road transport, but it clearly couldn't replace the capacity of rail lines or deep water ports.
Not at all. Not even close. It was an essential stopgap, literally keeping the armies in the fight, but it was incredibly inefficient for bulk supply compared to rail. The logistical strain was immense. The system only really eased its chokehold when rail transfer points were finally established around Paris, allowing rail to take over the bulk long-distance movements.
And focusing on the trucks themselves, 5,400 vehicles running 247, the maintenance must have been a complete nightmare.
A disaster waiting to happen. The trucks were routinely overloaded by field commanders desperate for supplies, and the lack of time for any preventative maintenance quickly led to catastrophic shortages of spare parts, especially tires.
The sources cite a really surprising detail about the tires.
It's almost unbelievable. The sharp discarded edges of cut-off C-ration can tops strewn along the sides of the roads. They caused heavy tire damage. But more broadly, the replacement factor for the crucial 2.5-ton truck, the backbone of the Red Ball, was set at a meager 2%.
2%? It's nothing.
It proved wildly catastrophically low for the conditions in the European theater of operations. It just created this constant scarcity of vehicles.
So the Red Ball was the temporary fix. The long-term solution was always going to be deep water ports. Cherbourg was the first major prize, but even after its capture, it presented these massive bottlenecks. What were the specific problems that crippled Cherbourg's capacity?
Cherbourg's reconstruction was a monumental task. They were targeting 6 Liberty ship berths and a total capacity of 28,300 tons per day. But Ruppenthal outlines 3 major interrelated bottlenecks. First was the lack of crucial equipment, specifically large cranes.
They just didn't have them.
Many of the civilian workers who operated cranes back in the United Kingdom had been left behind, and the military personnel responsible for port operations. They just weren't adequately trained in operating or maintaining heavy equipment under that kind of pressure.
So that's an institutional training failure. What were the other 2 big issues?
The second and third related directly to information failure. The lack of advanced information about arriving cargo vessels, they were called the ghost ships, was crippling. Ships would just show up in the harbor before port personnel had even received their manifests.
You can't unload a ship efficiently if you don't know what's on it.
Exactly. You can't stage cargo or allocate the necessary specialized equipment if you don't know whether you're dealing with bulk, rations, tanks, or, specialized engineering equipment. It led to massive delays and really inefficient handling, which severely limited the daily throughput.
The eventual opening of the Seine River ports, Le Havre and Rouen, must have felt like an administrative miracle after all that chaos at Cherbourg.
It was absolutely vital. Le Havre and Rouen, once they were cleared and repaired, they instantly compensated for the diminishing returns and high operational cost of using the small, shallow draft Normandy beaches and the isolated Brittany ports. But the true ultimate prize, the one that defined the strategic direction, was Antwerp.
Why was Antwerp considered the definitive solution, the logistical holy grail?
Location and capacity. It was substantially closer to the front lines than any of the French ports, which dramatically shortened the logistical tail. But more importantly, its cargo handling facilities were just world-class, capable of 80,000 to 100,000 tons per day under ideal conditions.
And it was captured mostly intact.
Virtually intact, including an enormous storage capacity for petroleum, oil, and lubricants, 2.6 million barrels worth. Ruppenthal calculates that supporting a division via Antwerp required only about 1/3 the logistical effort compared to supplying that same division via Cherbourg.
It sounds like the perfect solution, but it had this horrifying handicap that limited its use for months.
The location was perfect, but the timing was terrible. Despite its physical capacity, the port was highly vulnerable to the German V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket missile attacks. For 5 terrifying months, German missiles just rained down on the city and the port facilities.
Which must have terrorized the civilian workforce?
It terrorized the population, who were essential for dock operations, and it severely limited cargo clearance. The maximum intake might be 100,000 tons, but if inadequate transportation and depot facilities, constantly under threat, couldn't clear the cargo fast enough, the effective daily intake just dropped disastrously, sometimes down to 10,000 or 15,000 tons a day in December and January.
This systemic chaos leads us right to the core administrative crisis that just poisoned the well of trust between the field armies and the supply arm, the tonnage allocation system.
Yeah, the tonnage allocation system.
Yeah.
It was mandatory because the communication zone, faced with stretched lines and damaged ports, was only delivering about 11,000 tons per day in mid-September. And that was against much higher operational requirements. So the system was designed to ration what little supply was available.
But the field armies hated it. The sources say they objected to dealing with supply allocations in terms of tonnages at all.
They did.
Why that deep suspicion of the system?
Because the Army strongly suspected that the communication zone was focused solely on hitting the daily gross tonnage quotas that were dictated from high headquarters.
So quantity over quality.
Exactly. This meant they would ship readily accessible, heavy, but often non-critical supplies, what the Armies called fillers, to meet the bulk weight requirement, rather than the desperately needed specific critical items like artillery fuses, winter gear, or specialized tank parts.
That sounds like a complete breakdown of faith in the whole supply accounting process.
It was. If a field army knew their allocation was, say, 1,500 tons, they felt they had to pad their requisitions.
Yeah.
They demand 2,000 tons of everything just to ensure they received 500 tons of the one or two critical items they truly needed.
Which creates this vicious cycle.
It does. It led to hoarding of critical items at the front and this massive inflationary cycle in requisitions, which further confused and undermined the entire communications zone accounting system. The efficiency of the total effort was just severely degraded by this cycle of distrust and really bureaucratic focus on the wrong metrics.
We've established the logistical foundations of the stall. So now let's pivot to the human element, specifically within the 12th Army Group, which by late 1944 was the largest ground combat force the United States had ever fielded. And while it was generally effective, the sources highlight some marked shortcomings in generalship and command culture in one specific army.
Yeah, this is where Daniel P. Bolger's Zero Defects and the referenced work of Russell F. Weigley become essential. Weigley, looking back at the conduct of operations, he specifically identifies a core tactical weakness that characterized General Hodges' First Army, and that weakness was unimaginative caution.
What defined that caution, especially in contrast to the aggressive pursuit doctrine that had just delivered them to the German border?
Hodges' generals were noted as being technically competent but addicted to playing it safe. And this risk aversion, it manifested in avoiding bold, high-risk maneuvers that might have paid off with massive strategic dividends.
Like what, specifically?
Well, examples include avoiding the opportunity to bite off the Ardennes salient at its base in the run-up to the German offensive, or hesitating to fully exploit the fortuitous capture of the Remagen bridgehead over the Rhine later on.
That reminds me of that famous citation from Napoleon, that the safest options in war are almost uniformly the worst that can be adopted.
Exactly. The cautious approach, while it minimizes short-term risk, it maximized the duration of the campaign, and it allowed the enemy to reconstitute their defenses. And this stands in stark contrast to General Patton's Third Army and General William Simpson's Ninth Army, which were operating on the flanks.
They were taking more risks.
The sources are clear. They risked more, they maintained the initiative, and, surprisingly, they accomplished their objectives with significantly fewer losses than the First Army. The cost of caution was ultimately higher than the cost of controlled aggression.
And it sounds like First Army developed this highly centralized and frankly toxic command climate, especially when they were under pressure.
That's the consequence that Bolger explores. The rate of command relief under Hodges, which was often influenced by direction from Bradley and other superiors, was just excessively heavy, particularly during that critical autumn period when the campaign got really difficult.
How many were relieved?
4 division commanders and 2 corps commanders were relieved in quick succession.
And these reliefs were often controversial, right? Sometimes happening after successful engagements.
They absolutely were. A great example is General Corlett, who was commanding the 19th Corps. He was fired after a successful fight near Aachen, which was one of the first major urban engagements against the German frontier. The reasons for his relief were vague, often related to the commander's personality clashing with that risk-averse environment.
And this rapid, often seemingly arbitrary turnover poisoned the command climate.
It did. Subordinate commanders became focused on compliance, on centralization, and on risk avoidance, rather than on decentralized aggressive execution.
And this culture also punished things like inadequate internal reporting, even if the operational execution itself was sound.
Precisely. The historian cites the case of General John Milliken of the Third Corps, who lost his command partly for poor reporting. Now, this illustrates a command that prioritized centralized accounting and rear echelon conferences over trusting subordinates to execute quickly in fluid situations. The pressure to conform and report upwards outweighed the pressure to aggressively defeat the enemy.
Let's contrast Hodges' style with Patton's for a moment. Hodges was known for being detached and centralized.
Highly detached. The records show he rarely traveled forward from his command posts. For example, he only visited the 19th Corps command post 13 times between August 1st and October 16th. That's the entire period covering the pursuit and the initial attacks on the West Wall.
Wow, and his preference was to call his commanders back to him.
Exactly. He preferred recalling his subordinates for these lengthy, centralized conferences in the rear, which placed a massive premium on formalized reporting.
And that kind of centralized leadership must have significantly hampered the ability of his corps commanders to exercise the initiative you need during a fast-moving, logistically strained pursuit.
It had to. The decentralized decision-making that's required for exploitation was just curtailed. If a corps commander felt they couldn't make a decision without a lengthy consultation in the rear, or that they risked their career for inadequate reporting, they would just default to the safest, slowest option.
It's an institutional preference for caution.
It is. And it was reinforced by relieving commanders for perceived failures or even for just perceived risk. This is a major legacy that the modern United States Army has explicitly tried to overcome in its post-war doctrine. The emphasis on decentralized mission command is a direct reaction to the failings of the First Army Command climate under pressure.
So, while First Army was dealing with these command issues near Aachen, General Patton's Third Army, operating under those severe logistical constraints, continued its drive toward the fortress city of Metz and the West Wall. This became the proving ground where the United States forces were forced to adapt from maneuver to attrition warfare.
And this is the focal point of Christopher R. Gabel's analysis in the Lorraine campaign. Patton, defying that priority shift to the north, he maintained his aggressive offensive. But his troops ran straight into prepared German defenses, and the campaign immediately highlighted the critical difference between improvisation, which works so well in the pursuit, and meticulous planning.
The Moselle River crossing is the perfect example of this.
A perfect example.
So tell us about the failure at Dornot compared to the success at Arneville.
The initial attempt by the 5th Infantry Division at Dornot was a disaster. It was a disaster because it was a makeshift frontal assault against a prepared enemy, specifically the stiff resistance of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. The crossing lacked organized artillery preparation and was just subject to continuous, devastating hostile fire.
They couldn't get support across.
They managed to establish a tiny bridgehead, but German fire disrupted all their ferrying operations. So, lacking support, the bridgehead forces were eventually withdrawn, having lost most of their equipment. They learned the brutal lesson that the pursuit was over.
So what changed just a few days later when they tried again at Arneville?
Everything. The Arneville crossing was a success because it was executed as a carefully planned combined arms set-piece operation. The assault was supported by the covering fire of 13 artillery battalions.
13 battalions.
13. Plus, air support from the 19th Tactical Air Command's P-47 fighter bombers, and crucially, it was all protected by a massive smoke screen to conceal the maneuver. The 5th Division established a permanent, stable bridgehead, and that shift, it signals the definitive end of the mobile war and the return to classic military doctrine, detailed preparation for breaching obstacles.
But even with that success, the campaign revealed some fundamental flaws in United States Army operational doctrine, specifically regarding the triangular division organization.
That's a really critical insight from Gabel's work. The triangular division structure, which was introduced after the Second World War, it consisted of 3 regiments and was designed to be highly flexible and maneuverable. It was supposed to allow commanders to quickly shift axes of attack and defense.
But commanders often fail to use it that way.
They did.
How did Corps commanders end up stifling the design of the triangular division?
Well, instead of practicing the doctrine of plugging in temporary reinforcements from the Corps on a mission-by-mission basis, which was what was supposed to maintain the division's inherent flexibility, Corps commanders tended to assign specialized combat and support elements, tank battalions, engineers, or heavy artillery, to the division on a semi-permanent basis.
They were basically turning them back into the old square division.
Exactly. They were making up for the division's organic muscle by creating these heavy, ad hoc square divisions, which just diluted the division's maneuverability and flexibility. It made them predictable and slower in the kind of attritional fighting they were seeing in Lorraine.
And what about Patton's use of armor? It seems so paradoxical that the commander famous for armor exploitation was actually criticized for diluting his armored divisions.
It is deeply ironic. Patton's policy mandated binding his armored divisions into infantry-heavy corps. And the corps commanders just exacerbated this by parceling out the armored divisions by combat commands, breaking up their concentrated punch into smaller, subordinate infantry support tasks.
So instead of a fist, it was 5 fingers.
A perfect analogy. This dispersed armored strength, rather than concentrating it for a decisive breakthrough, was a pleasant surprise for the German defenders, who could then defeat the American attacks piecemeal. Third Army was fighting like the pursuit was still on, but without the necessary mass or concentration for the set-piece breaches that were now required.
And a major factor that compounded all this was the tank itself, the Sherman M4.
The M4 Sherman was fundamentally flawed for the role it was being forced to play. It was badly outgunned by the German Panzers, which mounted these superb, long-range, high-velocity anti-tank pieces.
And this was a doctrinal problem from before the war.
It stemmed directly from pre-war planning. The United States Army had declared tanks to be offensive exploitation weapons. They were designed to race through gaps created by infantry, not to engage in defensive combat against other enemy tanks. Consequently, the Sherman was built for speed and reliability, not thick armor or a powerful main gun. And American tank crews paid the ultimate price for this pre-war conceptual failure when they ran into serious German opposition.
The ultimate manifestation of this grind was the battle for the German frontier, the West Wall itself.
The West Wall, or the Siegfried Line, was this massive belt of fixed defenses. Now, it wasn't the gigantic underground fortress of legend like the Maginot Line, but it was still incredibly formidable. A dense network of tank obstacles, barbed wire, interconnected pillboxes, and fortified buildings. It was designed specifically to maximize attrition and absorb a shock offensive.
So when they reached places like Saarlautern, what was the nature of the fighting like?
It was horrific. An intense reversion to trench-style warfare, but focused on very specific small objectives. Gabel describes the fighting at Saarlautern as literally house to house and pillbox to pillbox. The infantry advance was measured in yards per day.
And it required massive firepower to make any headway.
The intensity was so high that the massive, high-caliber artillery units, including the 8-inch and 240-millimeter pieces, they had to be brought in to fire in direct support of small units. They were adjusting their fire on individual buildings and specific pillboxes while the infantry prepared to assault. This reliance on overwhelming granular firepower was the only way to breach the West Wall, and it just underscores a complete shift to pure attrition.
As the armies stalled against the West Wall and the weather deteriorated into one of the worst European winters in decades, the pursuit's logistical hangover hit its absolute peak, creating a catastrophic dual casualty spike in November 1944.
This section, it just reveals the immense hidden cost of command optimism. In November, as the fighting intensified, battle casualties rose sharply to 62,400 men. Now that's terrible enough, but the real tragedy lies in the non-battle casualty figures.
From the cold and the wet.
Primarily from cold, wet, and freezing conditions. Those figures jumped to 56,300 men. The total losses for November exceeded 118,000 men. And this near parity between combat and non-combat losses is just shocking, and it points directly to massive institutional failure.
That near equal number points straight to the leadership assumptions that the war would end before the winter.
The sources make the case explicitly, and the numbers are just damning. 46,000 troops throughout the European theater of operations were hospitalized with trench foot. That single disease, caused entirely by inadequate preparation, took the equivalent of 3 full infantry divisions out of the line.
And most of them wouldn't be back for months.
Most would be out of action, at the earliest until the spring.
So where did the blame for this catastrophic failure to winterize lie within the supply system?
The primary blame rested with a quartermaster, European theater of operations. He refused to place the large-scale orders necessary for the newly developed winter uniform, specifically the superior M1943 jacket, because of a serious and ultimately fatal miscalculation.
He thought the war would be over.
He believed the war would end before severe cold weather set in. This optimism was deadly. Furthermore, the shoe pack, the rubber boot, was identified by medical services as the only mechanical aid that substantially contributed to the prevention of trench foot. Yet it remained in critically short supply because the War Department and the theater staff were reluctant to fully adopt and procure it.
So while the armies were fighting the cold, they were also fighting a manpower shortage. Infantry units, which bore the overwhelming majority of the physical fighting, sustained 89% of the Third Army's total casualties.
And manpower planners in the Pentagon had failed utterly to foresee the intensity of the hard fighting along the German frontier, especially coupled with that terrible weather. The replacement system was designed for the anticipated slow pace of the pursuit, not the grinding attrition of the West Wall. And this led to a desperate, critical shortage of infantry fellers.
And General Patton, facing the brunt of these casualties, was forced to take some desperate, immediate measures to patch that hole.
He issued some highly controversial orders. He first drafted 5% and later another 5% of Army and Corps troops. We're talking primarily service personnel, cooks, clerks, anti-aircraft personnel, for immediate retraining as infantry fillers.
And they were breaking up units back in the States.
Yes. Back in the United States, they were forced to break up entire tank, destroyer, and anti-aircraft battalions that were meant to be sent to Europe as units. Instead, they were sending them over as individual infantry replacements. It was a massive disruption, but it was a necessary measure just to keep the front line functioning.
And on top of the manpower and equipment failures, the administrative distrust we discussed earlier boiled over into a severe ammunition allocation crisis in October.
The communication strain And that tonnage allocation system meant that reserves of critical artillery items, especially high explosive shells, were near exhaustion. Commanders cited the absolute unreliability of supply figures provided by the communications zone. They were getting figures that looked fine on paper, but the actual critical items were missing from the shipments.
So the hoarding cycle just got worse.
It worsened, pushing the armies to the brink of running out of firepower.
There is one incredible, specific detail in the sources that illustrates the true severity of this shortage. A detail that must have just astonished the field commanders.
It speaks volumes about the desperation of the 20th Corps fighting near Metz. In the last week of October, 80% of the ammunition fired by the 20th Corps in the attack on Mézières-les-Metz was captured German and Russian ammunition.
80%.
80%. Think about that operational reality for a moment. You are relying on scrounged enemy stocks in differing calibers just to maintain your own offensive effort. That is the ultimate sign that the logistical system had failed to meet the demands of the fighting.
Which brings us to the ultimate administrative test. The German Ardennes counteroffensive in December, the Battle of the Bulge, the entire system had to pivot overnight.
Patton's rapid pivot of the Third Army is considered one of the campaign's great administrative successes. Colonel Whipple, who was the chief logistical planner at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, he characterized the effort as one of the most professional performances of the entire war.
So what did that look like in practice?
Patton rapidly canceled his ongoing December offensive and reoriented the entire Third Army from an east-facing assault to a north-facing counterattack against the German breakthrough. Logistically, it was breathtaking. They had to reroute 12,000 vehicles along 4 priority roads, simultaneously establish a completely new set of supply points near Luxembourg City to support the northern axis, and restructure the entire signals network, all in the span of just a few frantic days.
And that effort is what allowed the relief of Bastogne.
This massive, unprecedented administrative and logistical effort is what allowed Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams to lead his battalion of the 4th Armored Division to the relief of Bastogne on December 26th. It showed that despite the earlier systemic failures, the logistical system could surge when it was properly directed and prioritized.
And the siege of Bastogne, of course, demonstrated the critical role of air supply when the ground logistics were physically broken.
The air supply effort was crucial for the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. Between December 23rd and 27th, 850 planes were dispatched to Bastogne, and they successfully delivered 850 tons of urgently needed supplies, especially medical materials, fuel, and specific ammunition. The effectiveness of this operation was estimated at 95%, which proved that air transport could reliably solve localized acute crises, even if it couldn't replace the bulk capacity of the ground system.
Looking back across this entire deep dive, the core tension is just unmistakably clear. The aggressive, successful push of the ground forces consistently tested and, at times, completely outpaced the planning and supply capabilities of the communications zone. The victory exposed these fundamental flaws in American doctrine, in equipment design, and in command climate that had to be furiously overcome mid-campaign through improvisation and just sheer determination.
That's the legacy, isn't it? The massive failures in equipment, provisioning the inadequate M1943 uniform, and the doctrinally mandated weakness of the Sherman tank, coupled with the centralization and risk aversion of certain command climates. They all combined to exact an unnecessary high cost. The victory was achieved not just by tactical brilliance, but by the physical resilience and adaptability of the soldier who had to overcome these massive institutional shortcomings just to survive.
So if we look at the legacy of the 12th Army Group, what is the key takeaway for how the United States Army evolved after this?
Well, the sources, particularly Bolger, they make it clear that today's United States Army represents the living legacy of an idealized memory of the 12th Army Group's successes. The subsequent focus on developing robust combined arms doctrine, rigorous training at modern centers, and the specific emphasis on decentralized ethical leadership, the mission command philosophy, these were all direct, explicit reactions to the logistical, doctrinal, and command failures that were exposed during the brutal autumn and winter of 1944-1945.
They learned some very hard lessons.
They learned hard lessons about the cost of centralization and the absolute necessity of sustainment planning that shaped the military structure for decades to come.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners, something to mull over. We often celebrate the massive, aggressive pursuit to the German border as this unqualified success. But the source material makes it abundantly clear that the most dangerous enemy facing the American soldier in the autumn of 1944 wasn't just the stiffening German army. It was often the High Command's misplaced optimism that the war would end quickly. That single leadership assumption, the quartermaster refusing to order the M1943 jacket, resulted in 46,000 non-combat casualties, the equivalent of 3 full combat divisions lost to trench foot. What does this massive hidden cost tell us about the essential nature of leadership, the importance of detailed accountability, and the danger of allowing strategic hope to replace cold, hard logistical planning during any high-tempo operation?
We hope this deep dive gave you a richer understanding of what it truly took to win the ground war in 1944.
We'll see you next time.